Howdy, all you delicious people. I am here today to review Disturbing Behavior. So, it's kind of interesting when watching this movie, for someone who had probably just recently gone back into watching this film, it's kind of funny to eventually see what eventually does get retained after watching this movie. Some people might go out of their way to call someone else a peckerhead, or somebody might consistently quote wrong, bad, bad, wrong, wrong, bad, or I need my fluids, or any number of things. Uh, Here's the thing that I thought was funny. So I just finished recently watching Superman 2, and in Superman 2, uh, uh, Superman's boss in that movie asked Kent, like, hey, haven't you been watching the news, Kent? And Kent's like, no, I was too busy reading Dickens. And so all of a sudden, when I am going into this movie, we immediately have this class who's reading Dickens. I'm like, what is up with Dickens? Like, why is all these movies absurdly all have to read Dickens? I don't get what this thing is. Really, I was just kind of like, this is so goofy how I just went from one movie that was talking about reading Dickens, and now I'm having a reference of Dickens is in some other movie. What a bizarre coincidence that this is. Uh, but yeah, there might be any number of quotes and any number of things that kind of pop out from watching this movie. Really, when I went back into watching this movie, I'm like, oh my god, is this the movie where it's like meet the beautiful little creatures that hide among the flowers? Like, is that this movie? Like, I do like remember that part eventually popping up in this film, but I had to like re-go into this movie and confirm it. I'm like, oh yeah, this is that movie. Like, that is the goofy, bizarre saying that ends up happening in this film. um, but that's honestly the only thing I really retained from this film. Everything else was just like re-going back into it. I'm like, oh yeah, that does happen in this movie. So a lot of people would kind of compile or have any number of kind of things that kind of feel like this movie. Maybe like the crazies or stuff like that, where you have like people in this small town that all of a sudden at some point something triggers in them to lose their mind for a brief time. And the interesting thing about this movie is we have the sheriff who's basically just covering it all up like nothing is happening, which I thought was fascinating about this film. Um, I actually did enjoy this movie. This was actually one of those where like I wasn't expecting it to be so good, and then it was. Because I was like, man, was this one of those where like I was like I was gonna put way too much faith in it to be a good film, and then I was gonna come back into it and just be disappointed. And no, it doesn't really do that. Uh, we we have certain things in this movie that I wish that we would have marinated a little bit more on. Like we have Steve's brother that I wish that they could have actually had him in the movie just a little bit more. Like had some kind of like homemade videos more so than what they do in this movie. They kind of have like little shots here and there of Alan saying some things and then leaving, but I wish they could have marinated that a little bit more with that character. I wish that we would have been given like some kind of like real actual homemade videos or whatever, like kind of showing this guy a little bit more. Like I think there was like little snippets, but that was about it. That was sad. That we couldn't have had a little bit more of that, but I guess there was a lot. There probably might have been a lot of stuff probably in the drawing board of this movie that didn't make it to film because they wanted to focus so much on certain things. Really, I'm kind of wanting to know, like, the brain noggin of the person writing this film. Why did they actually put this together? Were they going into having the choice of wanting to do this kind of film because in normal schools, a lot of times, a lot of teachers or a lot of people would want to force the drug Ritalin on students to just kind of like either numb them out or to kind of even them out or to try to make them a little bit less active or less like energy driven or whatever. However you want to like. I don't know what exactly Ritalin exactly was because I never took any of it because my parents were like, no, like we're not gonna have my kid take Ritalin. No, that's not gonna happen. Uh, Really, I kind of assumed that this movie was kind of taking cues from that, where like there were some parents that are seeing their kid that is kind of being uh into things that they don't want them to be involved in, so they're kind of neutering them, or they're kind of going and finding some drug like a Ritalin to even them out, so they don't want to go into those activities that they were doing prior. That really uh, their performance or their behavior, let's just say, changes from a person that is eventually leading to violence or leading to just a thing that isn't quite possibly politically or uh, profoundly like a correct behavior by a majority of people. So I said behavior a lot recently. Uh, it you can't help it. Disturbing behavior. You have to talk about behavior. But I kind of wonder if that was the reason, like Ritalin and like stuff that they were trying to adjust with youth to try to curve certain kind of uh, ways of which that people were going about their lives. Here's the thing that kind of is honestly goofy to me is that uh, they were trying to curve the behavior of the youth. But here's the problem with that. Basically, they completely neuter a lot of these kids to the point of just saying, like, well, I guess they're never going to have children and they're never going to produce an offspring. And basically, every single one of these people are going to die off and never have grandkids. Like, we have a lot of these, like, blue ribbon characters that are very much Leave It to Beaver. And so I'm like, dude, so they're never gonna pop out a kid? Like, so basically that's what everybody wants is to every single one of these people to be these blue ribbon people, but these people are also not going to be popping out a kid anytime soon. So, like, so they're never like maybe they're gonna have like a test tube baby or whatever, but still, like there's a number of ways to do a number of the actual baby making activities with not actually getting down to brass tacks or business or whatever, but still uh like that was my big thing of just like so whether they were trying to stop these people from getting uh like falling romantically in love with anybody or really just finding anybody just kind of like like this guy looks good or this girl looks great because eventually they will just get the ping to basically stop that behavior or really just have a freak accident that is to really turn somebody completely off to this person. So going into this movie, it's really just interesting. I really like it uh, because, of course, like I think it kind of favors the outcast, and really more than likely, like I didn't actually fall into some kind of like stereotypical whatever thing. I was kind of like in the middle ground of school or whatever. So really, like this movie does kind of speak to me, considering. I'm gonna pause here for a second. All right. But yeah, so like I kind of fell in like the middle of everything, where it's like hey, I'll be nice, the jocks, whatever, and eventually I did some kind of sports eventually, but uh, I was always kind of in the middle of everything because really just being a tall person compared to a lot of other people kind of just puts you in that middle rung of things where like I wasn't exactly like a geek or whatever. I wasn't exactly one of those, but I also wasn't a jock either. So it was kind of like this middle ground like thing. So like it's kind of interesting to have like Steve kind of really kind of mingling with almost everybody, because Steve is kind of one of those guys where he can kind of fall into anywhere. Like he could probably fit perfectly with the Blue Ribbons, or he could probably fall perfectly into uh, making friends with Gavin or Rachel or uh, any number of people, because he has that like universal look to him. So with that said, I think it's about that coveted time to just go into spoilers about this movie, because a lot of people have probably have heard of this movie already. Really, it's just one of those films where we are to see that obviously somebody is uh, being standoutish in a bad way. There's sometimes where this person is to pick fights a lot at school, or to be a person that seems to be depressed, or wears hoodies and wears the hood part over his head, just very shy or very depressed or very whatever. And so we have this school that is to consistently get together and have this neighborhood reach out program that is to start uh, curving certain students' behavior to make them all forcibly be with these blue ribbons, and force them to be people that are turning into very much Leave It to Beaver esh like people, that really anybody who isn't a blue ribbon is just like, well, like I don't like them. I don't like the blue ribbons just because I don't like how they're always nice all the time. It's kind of just like a like, yeah, that's great, but like can't you be upset about anything? Like being happy all the time is great, but like eventually it just gets tiresome. Eventually it just gets boring. And so eventually like you just need to see other sides of a person, and the blue ribbons won't show you that. So with that said, eventually it starts to get that these blue ribbon people are eventually starting to come after these people that are chosen to become blue ribbons, and eventually get changed and modified to be a different person. It seems like they are the same person, but really they aren't. So, with that said, I've talked for more than enough time about this movie in a cryptic like sense. I think it's about that coveted time to get in here to talk about this in a spoiler like sense. So let's get into that double five time territory and go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So let's get into it. So we have Steve and his sister Linda, or Lindsay. There we go, Lindsay, who are to move in with their parents to a new place. Uh, and of course, we have Steve, who is the new guy in town. And so, when Steve is to make it to this new school, we are to immediately see that there are some people that are standout students, and maybe not in a good way. We have Dickie Atkinson, who's in one of Steve's classes, that is to call his teacher a peckerhead, Mr. Rooney. Calls him a peckerhead and is to start a fight with one of the Blue Ribbons guys who is named Trent. Um, this guy supposedly is a motorhead, one of those guys that every single thing of what he wants to do is just to get another certain part for his vehicle, or another another kind of just customizable thing for his car. That's all that matters to him. And like, school doesn't even matter to him, because really, like, he even just shows up late for school, because what does he need school for? Because all he cares about is his car. So Steve is to eventually head on to lunch, and so we have Gavin and a guy who goes by the name of UV, that is to kind of give him the heads up of who everyone is. And it seems that in this school, besides any other, there really is just a ton of cliques. Like, this school has much more of a clique than I think any other school would have. Because I don't know how many times I would go into a lunchroom and it just seems like everybody's just sitting wherever. Like, a lot of times when people like sit in lunches, a lot of times people are just randomly sitting wherever, because lunch time doesn't matter to anybody. Like, it's not a lunchtime to just be like, oh yeah, I want to go into lunch to just have a long, meaningful conversation with anybody. No, like, my lunches were filled with just like, dude, I want to sit down wherever the heck is an empty spot and eat my food and then leave lunch. Like, that's all that, like, I didn't want to sit next to some clique. I didn't want to like try to like talk to anybody at the lunch. Like, yeah, there were some times where there were some friends or there were some people I knew there, but um like, really, lunches were just about like, dude, how quickly could I just sit somewhere randomly, eat, and be done with my day? Like, that's all lunches were. But I guess this is different for these people. So Gavin and UV, and it was kind of funny to see UV in this movie, because when I IMDb'd him later, I'm like, oh my god, this was the actor that was in like Final Destination, and like, he was in that movie and this one. Like, I didn't think it was the same guy. Like, those people look like night and day to me, like two different people, but it is what it is. So Gavin is to explain every single click to Steve in this lunch table, or around these lunch tables. Basically, mention the blue ribbons are basically the jocks, or the kind of leave it to Beaver Ash like people. He doesn't mention that, but I kind of do. Uh, we have the computer geeks that like jazz and all kinds of stuff, uh like the sound of their like computer getting turned on, I guess, like, gives revs their engine. um we have like also other, like, the Motorhead click, where funny enough, the guy from the movie The Forsaken, or Roswell, he was actually one of the Motorheads. And I was like, oh wow, that's cool to have seen to see that guy there. But sadly enough, he didn't actually have a role in this film. He was just kind of an extra that, I guess, eventually went on to do things afterwards. Uh, But yeah, and then there's also like I think there are also other kind of factions in here, but I don't remember them all. But yeah, so and then there's also like Gavin and UV that mentioned that like their thing is like hard rock and like they mention what their like drug of choices and stuff are because every single time like Gavin has to mention every single one of everyone's like drug of choice and sometimes it's not actually like a lot of times it's just like the sound of their own voice is their drug of choice or whatever. But anyways, so Gavin sets Steve up to understand everyone in this town and basically tell him it's like, hey, welcome to my nightmare and get ready for your next class kind of thing. So here's setting up the very beginning of this film because I tried to basically try to avoid that part. Because really, the very beginning of this film is that we have a guy who is named Andy. And so Andy is with his girlfriend, and Andy had gotten a change from being a blue ribbon with this girl who isn't exactly a blue ribbon. So Andy is on a date, I guess, with this girl in his car, and so this girl is really wanting to get with Andy, but Andy's like, you know what, like I'm not really interested. Like, you know what, I gotta keep all my fluids. Like, I have a game coming up soon, and so we have this girl who has a tattoo on her leg, and Andy's asking her, it's like why do you have a tattoo? Like, why would you like disgrace your body like that? And the girl is like, well, if anything, there probably is one thing that I'd like to disgrace. And we have this girl who is giving Andy a BJ. And so all of a sudden, while Andy is to get a hard on, he is to all of a sudden have his eyes glow red. And Andy is to take this girl's head and snap her neck and like just kind of push her off to the side, zip back up his pants. So we are to all of a sudden have the sheriff come in, who is Officer Cox, with his deputy. And so Andy is to open the door, come on out with the detectives, and so all of a sudden I think the deputy is to realize that the girl that Andy's with is dead. So Andy is to grab the gun of Officer Cox, shoot this deputy, and the sheriff is to be like, okay, son, like, just drop the gun and, like, everything will be fine. So Andy just goes off and drops the gun, goes, grabs the girl, shoves her out of the vehicle, drives away, and the sheriff does absolutely nothing about this. We have Gavin, who had seen the whole entire thing happen because he was just so happily walking with his dog and was to see two people making out. So Gavin is like, hey, like, great move there. Like, great, like, hey, we're going to maybe see something. So Gavin was to watch this whole thing go off like the entire time, and he can't believe how Andy had clearly continued to get away with this. It makes no sense, like how deep these blue ribbons people's pockets are, where they can basically get away with murder. But it makes sense the further and further we go along in this film. So so Steve is to eventually start getting more and more into school, and eventually more start to understand what is going on. So we had the kid uh, who was named Dickie, and so he, I guess, was supposed to go out one night to get a car part, but instead he was to be met by every single blue ribbon to go and collect Dickie to turn them into one of them. So the very next day, we have Dickie who is to destroy his own car, sledgehammering it and telling everybody, like, hey guys, you're gonna learn a thing or two, or you're gonna you like hey like watch this now because like you're gonna learn something from this. So we have Dickie who's destroying his car, and we have like Gavin and everybody just in awe of like, wait a minute, like he's destroying his own car? This makes no sense. Like, if anything, this guy loved every piece that he was putting into this car, and he really spent a lot of time working on his car. Why is he doing this now? This makes no sense. And so we just consistently see these blue ribbon people just crashing through these car or breaking through this car and all kinds of things. So we have like Gavin and we have UV who are kind of making this consensus that like these kids are now robot people and there's something wrong with them. Uh, that like they had been reprogrammed or something, and it doesn't quite make sense anymore. That in my eyes, uh, it doesn't make sense anymore of how they are or how they've just drastically changed overnight who they are completely. It doesn't quite make any sense. Uh, but supposedly we have these characters who tend to take a day or a couple days and eventually come back and be different people, drastically different people. Because I guess they went to some uh, seminar or something that is to curve their behavior. So Steve and Gavin, uh, we have Gavin eventually take Steve to meet a girl named Rachel, and so Steve is to say hello to Rachel, and so basically after Steve's initial hello to Rachel, and Rachel's looking at him like, and Gavin's like, "Oh, hey!" Like immediately, sparks like are flying, like love's in the air, and like Rachel's kind of like telling Gavin, like kind of like drop dead, like shut up. But so really, all of a sudden, once we are to actually see Rachel or Katie Holmes in this movie, that's when we are actually to start seeing her more than usual. Gavin is to also take uh, Steve into the boiler room where there is a janitor down there called Dorian Newberry. So Dorian is to pull off as if he is a ignorant person that doesn't know any better. Dorian evidently is to put all these kind of these rat sounds like out of this bizarre looking stereo that's supposed to make some kind of rat sounds that is to try and get the rats to go away from the school, but it seems like it does absolutely nothing for the rats. And really this Dorian, we are to naturally assume that this guy is just some idiot or just some whatever, but eventually when Steve is to hang out with Dorian more, he's to realize that that actually isn't true. That there's something more to this guy than what we are to understand. So we have Steve and we have Gavin who uh, who are to go and seek a banquet that is to be done in this town. This like blue ribbon banquet thing, or this blue ribbon conference thing, going and choosing who is going to be the next chosen person to be a blue ribbon. And uh, Gavin ends up finding out that the next person is actually going to be him. And so he's like, oh my god, my parents, they sold me out, kind of thing. Because Steve kind of goes the same route when eventually it seems that his parents eventually sell him out too. So Gavin is like, oh my god, my parents are going to force me into being a blue ribbon and like robotize me or whatever, change me or whatever. Like, you know what I'm gonna do? Like, I'm gonna wait for them to come. Like, I'm gonna wait for them to get me, and I'm gonna smoke them all. Gavin all of a sudden busts out this gun, and Steve tries to get this gun away from Gavin to stop him from doing any harsh or silly decisions. And because Gavin mentions how he's gonna kill anyone that's going to try to reprogram him, but Steve gets the gun away from Gavin, and so like Steve is asking Gavin like, "Well, hey, how about you just come with me? How about you just just like sleep in my house for a while. Like see what happens. Like let's see like what happens with that." But eventually they're going to come for him anyways. Eventually it's going to happen that Gavin is going to get reprogrammed. No matter how long he tries to delay it, it's going to happen. It's inevitable. They're going to get him in school anyways. So what? Stop going to school. So so Steve is to go to school the very next day and spend a little bit more time with Rachel and UV. And so all of a sudden we have like the kind of blue ribbons kind of make it into the lunch, and all of a sudden we are to see that Gavin is now conformed to be a blue ribbon. His hair is much shorter, and like he is having a much more cleaner attire. Rachel is just like, oh my god, like I need to talk to Gavin immediately. and and so Rachel is talking to Gavin. I'm like, why are you wearing these clothes? Like, what are you doing? And Gavin is like, well, like I've decided that I really want to start like actually applying myself, and this is the way to do it by being a blue ribbon. We have Gavin who was to ask one of the girls because they're doing a bake sale. So Gavin asks like, "Hey, how much for this?" And they say like, "Oh, just go ahead and just take it. Like, if anything, like your money's no good here, kind of thing." For today, I guess, because he's the new blue ribbon. So he's like, "Oh, thank you." So Gavin goes and is to join the Blue Ribbons, and immediately we have Rachel and immediately we have Steve that are really just not really just not liking this. So we get to have Steve who's just like, dude, enough is enough. Like I have to talk to these people. Like I have to talk with these blue ribbons. And when Steve is to talk to these blue ribbons and to talk about what he thinks they are or what he thinks they're doing or whatever, Steve just ends up getting beaten up because numbers game. And eventually a lot of the blue ribbons are like, dude, like, you know what, if you went with us and if you were one of us, like your life would be so much better. Like eventually when Gavin is to at first seem like he is just kind of playing a role, but he isn't, because Gavin kicks or kind of just like thighs Steve in the chest. Gavin tells Steve like, you know what, man? Like, I see things so clearly now. Like, things are so much better, uh, like, this way. And, like, if only you would join me, kind of thing. And, like, Steve has no interest in doing that. So, so, when so now we're gonna have to get to the point of both Steve and Rachel eventually going on to the ferry and eventually trying to figure out what is going on with this doctor that they have there, uh, the Caldecott or Caldecott, uh, Edgar Caldecott, uh, the main doctor that eventually is to change all these students. So we have Steve and Rachel that are just like, this is going too far. Like, too many students have changed now, and so we need to figure out like why all these kids are getting changed the way they are, and how this is all connected. And they figure out it's getting connected via this doctor that is there, that is Caldecott, and so they want to do a lot more research on him to figure out what exactly had led him to get to where he's changing all of these kids now. Because it seems like he's doing procedures on them to adjust their behavior. So, uh, while Steve and Rachel go off onto this ferry, Rachel is to talk about one of her family members, and I believe it's her brother. And so Steve is to also mention his brother and how he, like we they show little clips of him earlier on in the movie about him mentioning that don't worry about the snakes that are in the garden, worry about the spiders that are in your bed. Uh, so Steve mentions uh, to Rachel about his brother Alan, and it seems the reason why they decided to move to this new location is because of Steven's older brother who had decided to take his own life, and that's what kind of forced them to decide to move to this other location. Um, Lindsay was to uh, talk to uh, talk to one of her friends, and the subject of her brother, like her other brother Alan, had come up while Lindsay was talking to this friend of hers, and so Stephen like caught that conversation, and uh, Steve's father wanted to quickly try and change the conversation, and Steve was like, "Well, I guess that's what happens when I guess probably like hey Lindsay's friend, like I'm sure at your home like people love to talk about brothers or whatever, but here we try to we try to forget about it, or we try to like silence anybody who's going to talk about their brother in here." So like Steve just kind of walks off. So I don't remember the exact dialogue, but it's something along those lines. It is what it is. Uh, so both Rachel and Steve go off to eventually research Caldecott, and they find out that evidently he had been working at a previous mental hospital. That they're like, dude, we need to go there. We need to figure out like what this guy had done there. And so bizarrely, both Steve and Rachel could easily get into this mental hospital. There was no rungs or no nothing that they needed. There was no hoops that they needed to jump into. They could have easily gotten all the way into this mental hospital and no one would have said a word. So Rachel and Steve make it all the way into this mental hospital and eventually start looking around at all of the patients that seem very crazy and don't seem very like anywhere close to sane. Like there's one guy that is repetitiously just brushing his teeth like all the time, and there's like toothpaste just pouring out of his mouth. And there's also just a number of also other patients that are just kind of goofy and or odd. So while there is an orderly that is to make his rounds, we have Rachel and Steve who are to go into one room and close the door. We have this girl that is to start spouting about meet the beautiful little creatures that hide among the flowers, and she's to repetitiously mention that, and she's to get louder and louder, which is to all of a sudden have every single one of the mentally unbalanced patients start to bang against the windows of this girl's room to eventually, I guess, alert the orderlies to just like, hey, we should try to clear or calm this down. So, so Steve eventually finds out that this is actually Caldicott's daughter, and so Steve is trying to tell this girl to shut up, but she won't. So Rachel just punches this girl in the face, knocks her out, and then that's when they realize that looking at her, like her name tag, that she's actually Caldicott's daughter. And so really, when Steve eventually is to confront Caldecott about this, basically he just calls his daughter a mistake and something that like he could not correct, but it's something that I guess he could use for things somewhere down the line. Like, man, that's one way to like just talk about your daughter. And plus, also you mentioned like, yeah, she was never really all that bright, anyways. Basically saying that probably every one of these blue ribbon people are probably actually his technical children because of how he changed them and how like I guess he's making up for the fact that he couldn't help his daughter in the way that he wanted to change her and uh, have her be. So eventually they get all that they wanted from this mental hospital. So both Rachel and Steve run out of there to to eventually make it on to a ferry to make their way back home. And while they are to get gas, they are to get stopped um, by the sheriff, by the officer. And here's one thing that I probably should get into. So Steven, because of him getting beat up in the cafeteria, like Steve has no interest in being in the cafeteria. So he goes into the boiler room with the janitor to just eat his lunch. So Dorian is to ask Steven why he's not eating lunch in the caf, and Steven mentions like, well, I hate the calf, and Dorian's like, dude, everyone hates the calf. Like, so what? Uh, but then eventually we are to have Steven eventually realize that the janitor is much smarter than he is to led to believe, because Steve grabs a book from out of the janitor's jumpsuit and find out that actually he's been reading Slaughterhouse Rules or something like that, or some goofy book. Um, and Steve is like, "You're probably a lot smarter than you pull off." And Dorian is like, "Well, you know what? When people actually think you're dumb, like they make a lot of they make like things are a lot easier when people think that you're much dumber than you actually are." Uh, Also, let's get to this because I think we need to get to this to get to where like because the whole officer part that I just mentioned is almost kind of towards the end of this movie. So let's get some prerequisite things out. So we also have consistently a guy named Chug that is going after Rachel's character. It seems that he is consistently seeing her and is very interested in her. Like when Rachel is kind of waiting for Stephen because Stephen goes into the yogurt shop, and and that leads to him eventually talking to the Blue Ribbons, and Gavin comes in there to try and get Stephen away from the Blue Ribbons. Uh, Rachel is to be seen by Chug, and Chug is in a line of a grocery store and is to all of a sudden go and beat the living crap out of somebody in the aisle uh, just because he could. And then eventually the Officer Cox is to see Chuck beating the living crap out of these people. And of course he does nothing. He just like kind of picks him up and says like, "Okay, time to go there, buddy." So Chug is to eventually find Rachel in the boiler room. So Chug goes out to meet Rachel and asks her, like, "Hey, would you like to go out with me?" And Rachel's like, "Well, no, of course not." And we have Chug is like, "Why not?" And we have Rachel who starts coming up with every excuse in the book of why she wouldn't go out with Chuck. And eventually, Chuck is like, "Well, hey, I'm like he starts rambling off all these reasons why she should, like how actually really good that he is. Plus he starts like grabbing on her and like feeling her up inappropriately, of course, like he's getting really in her face about this, how she should date him, and like how he's like the omega baby kind of thing. And so we have eventually the Dorian uh, trap for supposedly the mouse like things that actually don't work on the mouse like things. It actually works for these blue ribbon kids. And this thing goes off, and all of a sudden, Chug scrambles to try and grab this supposed stereo thing that is to be for the rats, but it isn't. It actually affects more of the blue ribbons. So Chuck goes and breaks this thing, and Rachel is to go off, and so uh, Chug is to see the janitor come into frame, and really Chug is just there to give this guy crap and then to walk off. So I think we've kind of covered all the middle stuff, but there probably is some stuff here or there that I probably forgot about, like the bad, the wrong, the bad thing, and I'll probably cover that here right now. So Steve is to eventually come home one night, and I guess Lorna was to try to tutor Lindsay on something, and but it seems that Lindsay probably had gone off to bed. So Steve had come home to see Laura, who had, I guess, just started finishing up tutoring Lindsay. So Laura's to mention to Steve how like smart his sister is, and like he's like, well, yeah, of course I know that. So we have Lorna, who is deciding to go to the bathroom, so that way she can kind of like put water on herself and kind of like clean herself off. So while Lorna is doing that, we have Steve, who is like getting a drink of something, or just kind of just standing there with, I guess, this bathroom door open a little bit. And Lorna is to see Steve, and I guess Lorna is just somehow like attracted to Steve. So Lorna goes and uh, is all of a sudden starting to unclothe herself, and you can pretty much see almost a bulk of her chest, let's just say. So Lorna goes out there, and Steve is like, "Whoa!" Like this girl is revealing a little bit too much, and plus also like I've already kind of cemented that it seems that me and Rachel are gonna work out. So I'm not sure about Lorna. It seems like she's coming on a little strong here. So uh, Lorna is kind of throwing herself at Steve, and Steve is like, you know what? You are attractive, but I just don't think that I'm quite interested. Because Steve asked Lorna, it's like, hey, what are you doing? And Lorna's like, I don't even think I know. I just feel something, and I think that I have to act on it. And but then eventually Lorna realizes that, you know what, I realized that this is probably something that is wrong or bad or wrong. And then all of a sudden we have Lorna, who is to go and look at this mirror and crash her head into it. Like she headbutts this mirror, and all of a sudden her head is just start like gushing with blood. And we have Lorna that is to grab a piece from this mirror and start lunging at Steve with it, and then all of a sudden there's this tussle for this mirror, and this eventually leads to Lorna realizing that like this was a mistake. I need to get out of here. So like Lorna mentions that she has a big exam coming up the next day and that she needs to get out of here. I'm like, what the heck just happened there? So Lorna goes off uh, to eventually have Dr. Caldecott, who is to try to do some experimentation on Lorna to try to correct what had happened, the mistakes that he had made. Because he had mentioned that it's like, man, whenever these kids are to get a hard on, they try to beat somebody to death with it. And so, like, that was kind of an interesting, like, analogy, or an interesting kind of like metaphor is what to be going on with any number of these kids, which I thought was a really fun line. So I think that I've covered all the middle stuff. If anything, if I miss somewhere and there's like, oh, that's my favorite part of this movie, the part that he didn't say, I do apologize. But otherwise, it's finally about that time to pretty much call this one to the end of this, of where I finally just dropped off. So, Officer Cox is to, I think I'm gonna, on IMDb this, I think I can kind of go without it. Uh, so we are back in the scenario that I ended up being off with. So, we are in the scenario where Steve and Rachel are at this gas station to be stopped by this police officer. So this police officer is to mention to both of them, well, it's a little past curfew. Like, where are you guys going? And Steve is like, well, we're going home, like immediately. And so we're having the officer that is immediately to have both Rachel and Steve get out of their car, and the officer just goes and takes these people and thrusts him into this vehicle, and we all of a sudden see the janitor that is coming into frame driving in with his vehicle, and all of a sudden takes his rat stereo and smacks this over the head of this officer, opens the door for both Steven and Rachel to get out of the car. And so we have these characters who are going to now decide to get the heck out of this town. We are having Rachel go and get UV, and Steve is going to get Lindsay, and they are going to get out of here and go back to Chicago because that's where Steven thinks that they're the most safe, is just out of this town and out of this connection of these people that are going to manipulate or warp people's minds. So because also we had in this movie that Gavin was to also leave Rachel with this video documenting his last will and testament kind of thing, his last thoughts, and everything that was to quite possibly lead up to the point of him going and getting turned into a blue ribbon. So Rachel gets UV, and so Steve now has to get Lindsay. So Steve goes and grabs Lindsay, and so we have Steve's parents that are asking Steve, hey, where are you guys going? And Steve is like, we're going to get out of here. If anything, how about all of us right now get out of here and move to Chicago? And they're like, yeah, Steve, whatever you say. Hey, whatever you're feeling, we're going to do. We're going to help you. And, Steven is like, oh, thank God. So you guys are on my side. Thank goodness. And so all of a sudden we have Caldecott that is to pop up and say, yes, Steven, we want the best for you. And so Steven is to be like, oh my God, you called him? And Steven's parents is like, well, yeah, we want you to have him go on the retreats that normally everyone else goes on to, and we basically want you to become like a blue ribbon like everyone else. And eventually Steve ends up being called Steven, and so Steve turns to his parents of you know not to call me Steven, because the only people that call me Steven are these blue ribbon people, and my name is Steve. So Steven eventually tries to run out of this home with Lindsay in hand, to eventually be stopped by the blue ribbons. And so we really just have here that there probably is not going to be any way out for these people. So because Rachel, Lindsay, UV, and everyone eventually are to drive off to try to get away from all these people, and that leads them into a roadblock with all of the uh, let's backpedal. Because we eventually are forced to eventually have Rachel and Steven eventually go on and have to get experimented on, and then we get to the tail end of the movie. So I'm kind of rushing through a lot of this. So let's slow back down. So Steven gets out of his home to forcibly have to get dragged into going through the procedure that all the other blue ribbons have gone into. So Steven gets out of his home to forcibly have people there that are going to force him to eventually become a blue ribbon. So Steven eventually is to be at this hospital where he is to be strapped into this chair, and so is Rachel simultaneously. So Caldecott is to personally go and watch over Steven as he is to become this brand new blue ribbon. And so Steven, while talking to Caldecott, is kind of mentioning about all the stuff that has happened during this thing, and we have Caldecott that is just kind of coming clean about all of it. And we have Steven who hits Caldecott with the thing that his daughter was saying was meet the beautiful little creatures that hide among the flowers. And Caldecott is like, oh, like, wow. So Steven talks to Caldecott about his daughter, and like he kind of puts her down, like mentioning how she wasn't really all that bright, and that like that was a mistake that he couldn't correct. So that's why he tried to perfect everything via the stuff that he's doing now. So Caldecott eventually leaves the room, and Steven, before a thing is to go in his eyes, Steven is to eventually find a scalpel and cut one of the straps off and eventually start taking off this machinery. There's a orderly, or there's some doctor that comes in to try to stop Steve from doing this, but eventually he gets stabbed with one of the like the straps that Steven has on that he broke off and that he stabbed the guy with. So Steven gets this machine and slips out of it, and eventually rushes to go and find Rachel and free her from her device. And he's asking her like if she's okay and everything like that. I would have thought it would have been a really cool uh, kind of maneuver if Rachel would have actually been one of them, and that would have been such a crushing blow in this movie. But I think it would have been an interesting thing to just say, well, like it's too late for Rachel because she like Steven was to eventually find out that Rachel was one of them, and I think that would have been a cool spin. Plus, also like movies like Invasion of Body Snatchers will eventually tell you that usually the female of the lead character eventually is to turn into the villain to just shock people. But I guess that didn't happen. So Steven and Rachel are to be free. It seems that Steven is to have this little pipe that he's to hit people with. So both Rachel and Steve are to make their way out of this hospital to eventually find Chud there. So now we have to have Steven who is trying to fight his way through Chud, which that's kind of a mood point. Chud just goes and takes care of Steven, so Rachel now has to try to like take Chud down, eventually going and smacking him over the head with a pipe, which does the job. So Rachel and Steve try to leave. They try to get the heck out of here to eventually be caught by all the blue ribbons and Dr. Caldecott that is trying to stop them from getting out of this town. So we find that Dorian is to, I guess, be following Steve, and now I'm freaking having a problem between Stephen and Steve. So we have Dorian who is following both Rachel and Steve because I guess this guy just follows them everywhere. So Dorian is to reveal from the back of his trunk that he just has a bunch of these rat stereos. So Steve is starting to drive through these blue ribbons, and the blue ribbons are to be attracted by these stereos, so they're chasing after it. So Caldecott is to shoot Dorian's car, and I don't understand why. My assumption that maybe Dorian was a previous, like, equal to Caldecott and something happened with that relationship. Like, that's, I think, like, I thought I heard that somewhere, or I thought about that somewhere, where, like, Dorian might have actually been previously some kind of doctor that worked with Caldecott, but that relationship got strained, and so, Dorian just decided to vanish and just end up being a janitor at the same school that Caldecott was at, so he can maybe watch over him without him really knowing about it. I don't know. There might I'm probably way overthinking of this. Maybe it's just a janitor that ended up realizing what was going on much more so quicker than anyone else did, and so this janitor kind of invented some kind of counter attack to these students. So all the blue ribbons start to go on and start to grab onto Dorian's car. And so Steven eventually goes to Dorian and mentions, like, hey, like, what are you doing? And Dorian is like, well, like, there's no cure for these kids, and plus also there's no cure for me because Dorian had gotten shot by Caldecott's bullet and he's going to die. Because Steven is like, well, hey, maybe we can cure them, maybe we can change them, and Dorian is like, there's no curing these kids and there's no curing me. So every single one of these blue ribbons all chase after Dorian, as Dorian is now going to drive off of this cliff of this dam to eventually have all of these kids all die along with him, as he is to mention, like, hey, teacher, leave these kids alone, as he's going off onto the, like, so he's doing the Pink Floyd Breaking the Wall song that, like, they're going over the ledge with. So that is to eventually leave the hero and the villain left. So Caldecott is just scrambled to make his way down there to have to fight off Steve, and so we have this real, true, legitimate brawl. If like, we barely got any of that before, because Steven mostly a lot of times was either outnumbered, or even when he was to try and fight people like Chug, really just Chug just outmuscled Steve a lot. So really for this fight, like, it kind of seemed uh like Caldecott like was probably much older and much more experienced, but like Steven just had the will to just try to take Caldecott out. So fighting is to ensue, and eventually this is all to lead to eventually have Steven knocking Caldecott over the side of this ledge, just like his other people before him, because Caldecott just kind of mentions, is like, well, if I'm gonna live, there's going to be other schools, there's going to be other cities, there's going to be other places that eventually will do the exact same thing that I have done. Like if you leave one single blue ribbon that is to exist, like eventually this is going to spread again like wildfire. Believe me. And so Steven is to eventually bump Caldecott off to the side to make sure that doesn't happen, and so Caldecott is to get killed off. So, uh, so really here after this, really the entire thing is to basically have Steve and Rachel, UV and Lindsay all just to go off and find a new town and uh, and basically just figure out jobs to do and just make the best of what they can. Especially, I guess, without their probably not going back to school, they might just like maybe try and get their GED through other means, but like they're probably just gonna like they're probably just gonna all just go on and like have to forcibly get jobs after this to try to afford being able to live off the live off apartments or whatever, but at least they'll be together. So really that is to have them all go off and technically have their happy ending. But next we are to see a school of youngsters that seem to be a little bit uh, like rowdy and or undisciplined. So all of a sudden, a new teacher is to come into the frame, and it is to actually be Gavin. I guess Gavin did not die from all the other blue ribbons. I guess he had decided to not be a part of the activities of what all the blue ribbons were to do. So he was the only one who had lived. So Gavin is to chalk the words "go forward" on the chalkboard, and then he is to turn to the rest of the students and kind of start the class, and that's how the movie is to end. There might have been some stuff here or there that I did forget about or I didn't completely cover or whatever, but I like this movie. I apologize how I might have been kind of all over the place or I had to do a massive amount of backpedaling because I didn't realize that, like, oh yeah, like this part happened, and oh yeah, like, so I had to backpedal, but that happens sometimes with these movies where stuff will eventually be out of order or I get so enthralled that I kind of jump ahead or I jump the gun. But at least it might seem like I like have seen this movie because I have. I thought it was funny there was one comment where like somebody had mentioned that like I don't even think that you saw this movie. I'm like, well, yeah, I did. Like if anything there's some stuff where like I probably don't cover the movie line for line or like I don't have like a heavy amount of like background thoughts about what is to be done through the movie. Like for really like a lot of people want something quick reviewed or whatever, and for me to just go in and like, oh yeah, and like there's a lot of times where I'll have insights where it's just like, okay, this actor was feeling this in this scene, or like I watched commentary for some movie and I was like, oh hey yeah, like this is the notes they had for this movie. Or there sometimes we'll do a lot of actor interviews, or like I would watch certain kind of uh, uh, like interviews that they go on and talk about this specific movie, and they mention like how they were happy that this movie did well, or like they thought that this movie sucked, or they thought like they were very confused or baffled during the whole entire time that the movie was to go on. But anyways, um, I do those, but not for everything. And plus, also, there's a lot of times where I just want to get every moment of of the time that I'm awake to just watch another movie so that way I can review that and then just push it out. So without a doubt, I'm going to push my way out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.